managed to get it back on course. So they tried and bury that revolutionary. The honest truth is, without 1792 to 94, there would not be a French Republic. There would have been a French monarchy. Pitt and his armies would have restored the old order. All of that would have been smashed. But they want to try and pretend that's not the real history and present this as an aberration. Again, we shouldn't allow it. We should say that social change did come through revolution, and parts of that revolution wasn't just the old ruling classes. In order to win, they had to go along with, support, and at times ally themselves with far more popular forces. Peasant revolts, well, remember the majority of people lived in the countryside, but also in the towns, a new kind of political organisation from below, ones of direct democracy. I mean, the idea that democracy consists of going along once every 5 years to vote for Keir Starmer or something like that, that's not the idea of democracy that was at the heart of the French Revolution. Democracy meant, right, you might be working, but then in the evening you went along to your local section assembly in Paris, you know, the end of your street, and you had a political meeting and you debated and organised and, right, okay, what are we going to do, who are we going to send as delegates to the main central Paris? Right, the king's trying to do this, right, we better get armed, and tomorrow morning we're going to ring the tocsin, the alarm bell, and we'll all turn out armed to make sure they can't get away with this. And thousands upon thousands of people, day after day after day, were participating in it, not just in Paris, but right across the country. The scale of the mobilisation is one thing they want to deny in history, and it's worth going into that. There's all sorts of things you can read. You know, in just in one department down near Lyon, there were over 1,000 political. I mean, I say department, I mean about the size of a London borough, something like that. 1,000 political clubs meeting on a regular basis, involving tens of thousands of people, just in one. The regular participation is something like 1 to 2% of the population through the revolution. At the high points of the revolution, something like 10 to 15% of the entire population were attending meetings and taking it. That's a phenomenally high level right across society. They want to bury that part of history and the role of the popular newspapers and things like that. So we have to recall that history, you know, in order to remind ourselves and remind everyone else that radical transformation in the past required revolutionary methods and revolutionary organisation and mass mobilisation. Our rulers today want us to forget that because they're terrified that we might learn a different lesson on that today. Let me try and pick up some of the other. Somebody mentioned Babeuf, and I didn't have time to mention Babeuf because, look, it's true. There were some workers in France, and at times workers went on strike. One of the things, it's interesting, the day before the fall of Robespierre and Saint-Just, and if anyone doubts that they were bourgeois, one of the reasons the popular movement didn't rally to them, because they also introduced another maximum the day before, a maximum on wages, and which effectively cut wages by about more than 50% for most workers in Paris. So they undermined their base in that. So there were workers there, and they did go on strike for high wages, but they were a small minority. Most people were not workers in the sense that they did work, but they weren't factory workers and things like that. They worked in small workshops and things, artisans, shopkeepers, people like that, and of course the peasantry who were more interested in land. So the ideas of we would call collectivism, if you like, social ownership, collective ownership, didn't come naturally to people. That wasn't at the heart of the ideology of the French Revolution. The main ideas of the sans-culotte movement and of the Jacobins came from Jean-Jacques Rousseau, who was one of the great philosophers of the Enlightenment, that a republic based upon small producers, where everyone had some property, but no one had too much property. It was utopian. It was never going to happen, but it was the ideology that cemented that alliance together between the popular movement in the towns and the peasantry, and some of the bourgeois leaders, the Jacobin leaders, could rally around that powerful idea. So it might have been utopian, but it was the ideology that allowed them to carry the movement to success. What did happen after Thermidor, after the fall of Robespierre, there were lots of complicated things going on. There was a group around somebody called Gratius Babeuf, called themselves the Conspiracy of Equals, who began for the first time to go beyond that idea of individual ownership to more collectivism. Not collectivism of production. It was more what they said is we should produce all of this stuff, and then what should happen? It should all be brought by individual small producers. It should all be brought to big warehouses, and from there should be distributed on the basis of need. A step in the direction, not the full, because it wasn't about collective production, it was about collective distribution, but nevertheless a step forward to this idea that, you know, we give to people according to their needs, and it's got to be organised communally. A very big step forward, and Babeuf organised a newspaper and a small group, and in order to try and carry out an insurrection. It wasn't that important, and it wasn't that big, and it got very easily crushed, and they got guillotined. But it's the ideas, it was the first inkling of ideas that would develop later in the course of the 19th century. And so we should celebrate Babeuf as part of our tradition, because it was the first people to have a political organisation and a newspaper which at least talked about collective distribution on the basis of need. Not a full-blown socialist programme, but an important early part of our tradition. I would say much more about Babeuf. Ian Birchall wrote a very good book about Babeuf, which I think is still available in maybe in bookmarks, I don't know, which is worth reading. Okay, right, the difference between French and English, I think that's largely a myth, to be honest. England wasn't particularly gradual. There's a fine revolutionary history in Britain. You know, from the peasants' revolt of the 1300s right through, the English Revolution was a revolution. Above all, did cut the kids' head off, did institute a republic. What is true is that once you had the compromise, especially of 1688 and the so-called Glorious Revolution and bringing in William of Orange, then the Whig version of history, if you want to get the best version of it, read Macaulay, of gradualism, is become the official ideology of England, because they want to bury that revolutionary history. That is certainly that is certainly true. The next one, but I didn't have time to go into that. The question of slavery, women, etc., was a massive part of the French Revolution. Lots of the French aristocracy and the French bourgeoisie depended on slavery, especially the Girondins, because they were mainly based in the southwest around Bordeaux, and that was a key part of the slave trade. So lots of them were tied to the slave trade. It's important to understand that wasn't true about sections of the Jacobins. Robespierre, from the very beginning, long before he came near power, I'll quote him directly, the moment you pronounce the word slave, you pronounce your own dishonour. So from the very beginning, the best sections of the bourgeoisie were against slavery, as was much of the popular movement. But what was decisive was once you start talking about the words of Rousseau, the philosopher, that inspired them, and he used the word men, men were born equal, but everywhere are in chains. And then the slogans of the revolution: liberty, equality, fraternity. It's not a big jump then, if you're a black slave in Haiti, one of the main French colonies, to think, why doesn't that apply to us? Why can't we have liberty? Why can't we have equality? Why can't we have fraternity? Why can't we be freed from the chains as well? And that's what they did. Read C.L.R. James's brilliant book, The Black Jacobins. They took control of their own destiny under the slogans of the French Republic. They were fighting under those banners against the slave owners, including sections of the French aristocracy and the bourgeoisie, and a successful, long, complicated revolution. It wasn't easy, against both the French and the British, who were trying to restore it as well, and succeeded. And that gave power to those people in France, including large sections of the popular movement, to support that. And they did abolish slavery, and there were black deputies. And chairing the National Assembly in Paris in the 1790s, in the middle of revolution, was a black woman when they voted to abolish slavery everywhere under French control. But it was largely driven by taking the ideas of the revolution and the slaves themselves in the colony saying, we're going to fight for our own liberation. The emancipation of slaves was largely the act of the slaves themselves. And yes, sections of the radical revolutionaries in France supported them in that process, and that was an important part. Women, again, the same thing happens. I mentioned, some people asked earlier on, honestly, one of the best things you could read about the French Revolution is not a history book, it's a novel. It's called City of Darkness, City of Light by Marge Piercy. And what she does, she has 6 characters, all taken from different social layers, and weaves the story of the revolution through telling the story of these characters and their interactions. It's brilliant, and it gives the best flavour. But in particular, she has Claire Lacombe, one of the Society of Revolutionary Republican Women. There were women's organisations, especially in Paris, at the heart of the revolution, who again took the idea, liberty, equality, fraternity. Well, we'll have some of that as well. Why can't we have the same rights? Why can't we be part of that? Why can't we fight for real social change? And they did organise quite successfully. I played a key role in the insurrection of August 1792. The women played a key role. In October 1789, when they marched to Versailles and brought the king back to Paris, it was the women from Paris who led that march. So women played a central role in the revolution, but at that stage weren't able to break through. There were debates in the Jacobin clubs about extending the franchise to women, and they got a big hearing, and lots of men supported that, but not enough to break through. So it did get a hearing, they played a central role, but it didn't quite break through. Last couple of points, what do I need to do? Look, I've got time to go through. Look, 1832 and Les Miserables and all that. Look, the fundamental problem was 1830. You had, that comes to a point at the end. After the fall of Napoleon, the Congress of Vienna, all the reaction powers did restore the monarchy in France. But the monarchy did not dare touch the gains of the revolution, didn't dare touch restore feudal rights, did not dare touch the land that had been taken from the church, did not dare touch the land that the peasants had got. It didn't dare push the reactionary programme through internally, and it began to a little bit, and all that happened in 1830 was they got kicked out, and a bit like in England in 1688, Louis Philippe, a king who would accept the bourgeois control of society, was put in. The 1832 thing, the problem with an insurrection, when they did those barricades, all very nice in Les Miserables, they had about 3,000 people in one section of Faubourg Saint-Martin in Paris. Very heroic. Problem is the National Guards on the Republican side had 40,000 people and a shed load of cannon. Now, there's only one outcome to that battle, isn't it? In other words, if you're going to have a revolution, make sure you've got the forces on your side. Because if you go into a battle with 3,000 of you behind a barricade and 40,000 people over there defending the existing order with cannons, you know what the end result is going to be. Revolutions work when you've got mass support and mass mobilisation and overwhelming numbers on your side, and so I think there's a lesson there. Last couple of points. From the King's execution, most of the bourgeoisie in France did not want to execute the King. Did not want to. They were pushed into it by Robespierre principally, because he understood that if he executed the King, he wasn't bloodthirsty. Robespierre was the only person who opposed the death penalty in the National Assembly, by the way. But then when they wanted to spare their king, he said, look, I wanted to abolish it for everybody. You didn't want to abolish it for ordinary people, so now you want to spare the king. Bugger off, understandable. He understood, and the Jacobins understood, that if they forced the National Assembly to execute the king, it tied the bulk of the bourgeoisie to a defence of the revolution. And that was what that was really all about. But Napoleon's a very complicated figure. Napoleon was a revolutionary. He was a Robespierreist. Some of the other generals who later on were actually Maratists. Some of the people who were in Marat's organisation and on the Friend of the People ended up as key generals in Napoleon's army. Napoleon was a Robespierre. He was imprisoned after Thermidor briefly for being a supporter of Robespierre when that came. So yes, he wasn't just an opportunist, Robespierre. He won his credentials in 1795 when there was a 25,000 strong royalist insurrection in September 1795 in Paris, really to turn the clock back completely and restore the revolution. Napoleon, as a young general, went out there with only a couple of thousand people against 25,000. That's where his famous quote, "Don't worry, a whiff of grape shot will disperse them." That's where that quote comes from. And he defended the Republic against the royalist reactionaries. That's how he got the reputation. So his reputation was, I am the person you can rely on to defend the gains of the revolution. That's how he came to power. And despite him then becoming, crowning himself emperor, despite everything, he never rolled those back. He was about, yes, he did deals. He did deal with the Catholic Church, the Concordat, but that included all the church land that had been confiscated were never given back to the church. They stayed with the bourgeoisie who now got them. All the abolition of church feudal dues, they were gone. So it was a deal on Napoleon's terms. So Napoleon, yes, he was an egotist. Yes, he had all sorts of bad things. And I'm not saying he was a nice person at all. But the idea that he was just an opportunist, yet he came out of a revolutionary tradition, and his project in France was to stabilise things on a new basis, but which kept intact the central gains of the revolution. Final point, and then I'll shut up, which is republicanism today and bourgeois nationalism. You can take from republicanism anything you want. Every year in September 1792, the French army does a military fly past at Valmy and so on and celebrates, this is our tradition, the power of French military and French imperialism. I was there in 1789 in Paris when they celebrated the revolution. All sorts of reactionaries were doing that kind of thing with the tricolor and that. There were other parts, if you were in the east of Paris, where very different celebrations were going on. People with the red sans-culottes caps toasting Marat, toasting the Jacobins, saying we need a rerun of the French Revolution, etc. Like all of history, you can take different sides from it. The situation in France today is nearly all of the forces use the revolution and the republic for reactionary purposes. When not just the Rassemblement National, who I hope get beaten tomorrow, and I hope we have a movement that smashes them because they are fascists and we need that to happen. They wrap themselves in the tricolour and the Republic for reactionary purposes. So does Macron, as I said, and so do people like the Communist Party, etc. They all wrap themselves in the tricolour in order to say we're all that. And the way it's been used, for example, to promote Islamophobia in France is absolutely terrible. The Republican secularism, what does that mean? You're not allowed to wear the hijab in public. So largely in France today, republicanism and etc. is a reactionary force through and through. But that doesn't mean we shouldn't learn from its history. But today it's not. Just in the way that in England, is English nationalism today a progressive force? No. Was it back in the 1640s? Well, yes, it was a little bit more progressive back then. Things change in history. So yes, we can celebrate the history, but if you see somebody talking about Republican values today in France, there's a 99.9% chance they're doing it for reactionary purposes, not progressive purposes.